Let me start by saying today is a sort of sad occasion. I'm the Edward Said professor at Columbia, and today is the 14th anniversary of the death of Edward Said. So it's a sort of a sad occasion. I'm going to be giving you a talk which is drawn from work I've been doing towards a book, which doesn't mean that there's a book about to come out. It means that I'm working to try and finish a book. And so some of what you hear today hopefully will be familiar once the book comes out, and I'd be interested in your responses. But it's a little tiny piece. Part of the thesis of the book is in the piece that I'm going to be reading to you today. The momentous statement that Helga just referred to, made on behalf of the British Cabinet on the 2nd of November 1917 by Arthur James Balfour, His Majesty's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, is usually looked at in terms of two sets of issues: the interests and designs of the great power that issued it, Great Britain, or its ostensible subject, a national home for the Jewish people. People mainly look at it in terms of British policy or what it meant for Zionism. And I think there's been ample historical research done on both of these topics. I would argue that a topic that hasn't been fully explored is how important this declaration was in terms of the aims of the Zionist movement, a self-described colonial endeavor. For decades, the Zionist movement talked about itself proudly as a colonial movement, which at the same time was a national movement in the making, a movement which the British Empire chose to support via this declaration. Probably many of you know political Zionism's ultimate objective, as laid out by Herzl in his famous booklet Der Judenstaat and in his private writings, was as far-reaching as it was crystal clear. A Jewish state, not national home, a Jewish state, meaning Jewish sovereignty and Jewish control over immigration into Palestine. That is what he always wanted. That is what the Zionist movement always wanted. And whatever role imperial interests played in British intentions in Palestine, and I've argued in the last of the books that Helga mentioned, British Policy, that the British had decided long before World War I and long before they contracted with the Zionist movement that Palestine was vital to their strategic interests. They decided to take Palestine long before the war. And that's why they took Palestine, and that's why they issued the Balfour Declaration. It had a great deal to do with the brown eyes of Chaim Weizmann. It had a great deal to do with a variety of other factors, but the key issue was for the British was strategic. They needed Palestine to protect Egypt, and they intended to have it even before the war began. Whatever role imperial interests played in British intentions in Palestine, sovereignty and complete control was what the Zionist movement consistently fought for over the ensuing half-century, from the Declaration onwards, and eventually obtained. It did so primarily as a result, as you probably know, of 2 decades of unstinting British support secured via this declaration and later the League of Nations mandate based upon it, but also thanks to this movement's own prodigious efforts. Now, when abstracted from the all-consuming and passionate emotions relating to Zionism, as well as from the multiple concerns of British imperial policy at a critical point during World War I, the Balfour Declaration has another, less regarded aspect, which I am arguing in this talk this evening is of paramount importance. I am not going to talk about its importance to Zionism, and I'm not going to talk about its importance to British imperial policy or about the Declaration itself. The perspective I want to talk about was the perspective of the people of Palestine, whose future the Balfour Declaration ultimately decided. As you said, it also ultimately decided the fate of the State of Israel. But I'm going to look this evening at how it affected the Palestinians. And that's why the title of my talk is The Balfour Declaration from the Perspective of Its Victims. For the Palestinians, this statement was a gun pointed directly at their heads. And this is particularly the case given the imperial ambiance of the beginning of the 20th century. If you want to see a little bit about that ambiance, go and see a not great but worth seeing movie called Victoria and Abdul, just for a sense of what British imperial, the Raj was like, what British imperial rule was like, how the British thought, what this declaration meant in terms of that kind of an ethos. Whether or not contemporary British statesmen considered it in these terms, the declaration in effect, and this is the key argument that I'll be making in the book about the declaration and other things, the Balfour Declaration in effect amounted to a declaration of war by the British Empire on the indigenous population of the land it was promising to the Jewish people as a national home. The declaration launched what I argue in this book, and what I'm going to argue tonight, has become a century-long assault on the Palestinians aimed at implanting and fostering this national home and later the State of Israel at their expense. So I'll be looking at the Balfour Declaration in terms of how it impacted the Palestinians and how they reacted to it initially. From its inception, in its self-view and as it has to be viewed objectively, the Zionist movement was a colonial enterprise in search of a metropolitan sponsor. After having failed to find that sponsor elsewhere, whether in Germany or in France or in the Ottoman Empire, the leaders of the movement succeeded with the wartime British cabinet. Not my topic. You can read all about it elsewhere. The Zionist movement thereafter had the support of the greatest power of the age, a power that was about to become one of the victors of the First World War. Whereas the Zionist movement had begun to be viewed with concern in Palestine as early as the late 19th century, the Balfour Declaration meant that the country was now threatened by a far greater danger. Indeed, at the very moment that the declaration was issued, British troops were advancing northwards through Palestine. They took Jerusalem a couple of weeks later, in early December. I'm not going to read you the text of the declaration. It's already been read to you. And I hope you listened carefully, because the drafting was done by people who'd spent their whole academic career learning Latin and Greek. They were linguists. They were people who understood language. They were people who used language. They were people to whom language was meaningful. There was not one word in the Balfour Declaration that was not fought over and debated for months by some of the most highly educated people in the United Kingdom. There is not one word in it. Look at the expression civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in another country. Some people have political status. Some people have civil and religious rights. Those are not casually used terms. Each of them has a weight, a valence, a meaning. The overwhelming Arab majority of the population of Palestine, which was then around 94% of the total population, went unmentioned by Balfour, except in a backhanded way. The existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. In other words, 94% were the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. They were not described as a people. The words Palestinian and Arab do not appear in the text of the Declaration. Furthermore, and this has to be stressed, they were offered only civil and religious rights and no political or national rights whatsoever. By way of contrast, Balfour ascribed national rights to what he called the Jewish people, who in 1917 were represented in Palestine by 6% of the total population. Ironically, most of this 6% was made up either of Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews or of Mizrahi Jews, Eastern Jews, who were overwhelmingly non-Zionist. The number of political Zionists who had come to settle in Palestine and stayed at this stage were in the realm of 20 or 30,000. Regarded in this way, Britain's backing for Herzl's aims of Jewish statehood, sovereignty, and control over immigration had portentous implications. It meant British support for bringing into Palestine and implanting a foreign majority at the expense of the indigenous population's rights and ultimately of its existence as a people on its own land. Another important thing about the Balfour Declaration is it's not just a statement by the British cabinet in 1917, by the greatest power of its age, by the power that was conquering Palestine as Balfour issued it. It becomes part of the mandate, and it infuses the mandate. The whole mandate for Palestine that the British get from the League of Nations a few years later in 1922 includes the text of the Balfour Declaration and basically elaborates its various points in a number of articles. So it's not just a declaration by the British. It becomes the foundation stone for what the League of Nations does and tells the British to do in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration thus meant that the Palestinians faced the eventual, and I would say indeed virtually inevitable, prospect of being outnumbered by unlimited Jewish immigration and of losing control of Palestine to the Zionist drive for sole sovereignty over a country that was then almost completely Arab in population and culture. Such a prospect may have seemed far-fetched when the declaration was issued. It took just over 3 decades and the mass expulsion of most of the Arabs of Palestine from their homes in 1948 for all of these things to happen, but happen they did. the import of the 67 words of Balfour's statement for the Palestinian people involve an underappreciated perspective, and that is the focus of my talk this evening. So I'm going to be talking about the Palestinians and how the Balfour Declaration affected them. In the years before the war, in the years before 1914, there had been trepidation among many Arabs in Palestine about the rapid progress of the Zionist movement. If you're interested, there's a couple of chapters in Palestinian Identity, one about peasantry and Zionism, and one about the press and Zionism, which go in great detail into these reactions. Starting as the concern of a few, this became a widespread sentiment as the Zionist movement, grew in strength and as immigration to Palestine increased. This concern was visible in the Arabic language press, particularly the Haifa paper Al-Karmel and Palestine in Jaffa, which published over 200 articles hostile to Zionism in the years before World War I. One of them, published in Palestine, argued, it was titled "Strangers Ghurabat fi Ardina." It was titled, if this process continues, we will become strangers in our own land. So it's not like people didn't see what was coming. Among the peasantry in areas of intensive Zionist colonization, Zionist inroads were felt in concrete terms. The movement's ability to purchase large tracts of land, largely but not entirely from absentee landlords, and the Zionist doctrine of Hebrew labor, avodah ivrit, often meant the removal of those working the land. As a result of these land sales, many peasants saw themselves forced off land they had seen as theirs for generations. This had also to do with the Ottoman land law and other things I don't need to go into, but those of you who are Middle East historians will know what I'm talking about. Some of these peasants had suffered in armed encounters with the first paramilitary units formed by the European Jewish settlers around the period just before World War I. Their trepidation was shared by Arab city dwellers in Haifa and Jaffa and in Jerusalem, the main centers of Jewish population in Palestine then and now, always the centers for Jewish population in this country, who observed with mounting concern the constant arrival of new European Jewish immigrants in the years before World War I. Now, after the declaration was issued, word of it spread in most parts of the world immediately. In Palestine, however, the declaration went virtually unnoticed for a short period of time. This shouldn't be surprising. For one thing, all local newspapers had been shuttered since the beginning of the war. So most people in Palestine did not have immediate access to news of any sort. Then, after British troops occupied Jerusalem in December 1917, a strict military occupation regime banned news of the declaration from being spread, and in fact, the British authorities didn't allow any newspapers to open in Palestine for nearly 2 years after they occupied the country. It was only in 1920 that the first papers were allowed to restart. News of the Balfour Declaration, therefore, reached Palestine only with much delay, trickling in slowly via reports in copies of Egyptian newspapers that travelers brought with them from Cairo. So it really took a long time for people to find out about this. But there were less immediate reasons for the delayed and initially muted reaction to the Balfour Declaration. And these relate in part to the wartime conditions that were quite extraordinary in Palestine during the last months of 1917 until the fighting ended in November 1918. The fighting in Palestine was particularly fierce. From spring through late fall, the southern parts of the country were ravaged by a series of grinding battles involving trench warfare, intensive artillery bombardments between the British and Ottoman forces. During this period, the British launched a series of offensives which slowly pushed back the Ottoman defenders of the country. The fighting then continued in the center and north of Palestine throughout the winter and continued in the spring of 1918. In many regions, the war's direct impact caused intense suffering. And I'm going to give you some figures which indicate how drastic the impact of the war was on Palestine. By the war's end, Palestinians were already prostrate and exhausted by severe wartime shortages. The Allies imposed a blockade. This is a region that had been incorporated into the global economy. They were exporting crops like cotton or oranges, and they couldn't tear up the orange groves. They couldn't rip up the cotton fields and start planting food. So there were grave wartime shortages as a result of Allied blockades. There was penury. There was dislocation and famine. Draft animals had been requisitioned. You couldn't farm without your camel or your donkey or your other working animal. A plague of locusts hit the country one year, and there was draconian conscription that sent most working-age men to the front. 4 of my uncles were conscripted during World War I by the Ottoman army and served from the beginning to the end. They were lucky to survive. The Ottoman Empire suffered the heaviest wartime death toll of any major combatant power, with over 3 million war dead, or 15% of the total population. Most of them were civilians, about half of them were Armenians killed during the genocide. But any way you cut it, this was the heaviest death toll of any major competent power. Greater Syria, including Palestine, suffered 500,000 deaths due to famine alone between 1915 and 1918. Civilian deaths were compounded by horrific war casualties. 2.8 million men were mobilized, 750,000 of them died during the war. More than 1 in 4 Ottoman soldiers died during World War I. Again, the highest proportion of military deaths of any combatant power. Casualties among Palestinian and other Arab soldiers were high. For units that were recruited in the Arab provinces were heavily represented in every single of the most bloody and most contested battlefields of the war. Gallipoli, there were several Arab divisions. The Caucasus, several Arab divisions. Mesopotamia, several Arab divisions. Sinai, a large number of Arab units. And the battles in Palestine, a large number of Arabs from different provinces were engaged. The impact of all these factors on Palestine was intense. The demographer Justin McCarthy has estimated that after growing about 1% annually in every one of the pre-war years, Palestine's population declined by 6% during World War I. So what would have been a 4 or 5% increase, in fact, was a 6% decrease over those 4 years. It was against this grim background of mass suffering and deprivation and the advance of an occupying army in Palestine that Palestinians learned in a fragmentary fashion about the issuance of the Balfour Declaration. Although Palestinians had pressing everyday concerns as the war wound down and as the survivors of the chaos of war and displacement returned home, there is in fact evidence that they reacted with dismay to the news of the Balfour Declaration when it finally reached them. The shock of this document, when it finally penetrated Palestinian society, was exacerbated by a British occupation that marked the end of 400 years of Ottoman sovereignty. Think about that. That's twice almost the lifetime of the American Republic. That's a very long time. That's 20 generations. People in this part of the world had been ruled by the Ottomans. Political identities in Palestine had evolved in the late 19th century in keeping with global shifts and the considerable evolution of the Ottoman state. But the Ottomans had governed this region for so long that it was actually hard for most people to even conceive of not living under Ottoman rule. A section of the talk I'm going to skip here, but that had begun to change before World War I, but it still was a factor in people's minds. There was, however, a significant and rapid evolution in the way Palestinians saw themselves in the immediate post-war era. Among the many wrenching changes that took place in Palestinian society during and immediately after World War I were changes in long-held notions of identity. You can, again, Palestinian identity is mainly focused on this pre-war and immediate post-war period. In a world where nationalism, a quintessentially 19th century phenomenon, had been gaining ground for many decades, a great war, a world war, driven in large part by unrestrained nationalism. It was started by a nationalist shooting the Austro-Hungarian crown prince. Nationalism started the First World War in a certain sense. A war that was driven by the unrestrained nationalism of all the powers involved provided a major boost to the national idea globally. And this was true in Palestine and other parts of the Middle East as it was elsewhere. The enhanced salience of nationalism and of the idea of self-determination was compounded towards the end of the war by the espousal by Woodrow Wilson and by Vladimir Lenin of the principle of national self-determination, albeit with quite different aims. Whatever their actual intentions, the actual intentions these two leaders may have had, the apparent endorsement of the national aspirations of people the world over by two ostensibly anti-colonial powers had an enormous impact. We actually now know that Wilson had no intention of applying these principles to most people who had hopes for national liberation. In fact, he confessed that he was bewildered by these people who came to him in Paris, most of whom he had never heard of, responding to his call for national self-determination. Margaret Macmillan's book, Paris 1919, has a brilliant description of this. Nevertheless, as a result of the hopes aroused and then disappointed by Wilson's 14 points, by the Bolshevik Revolution, by the Versailles Peace Conference, peoples all over the world rose up in a massive revolutionary anti-colonial upheaval in 1919 in Korea, in India, in Egypt, and many other places. The Palestinians, who were still suffering from what might be described as collective post-traumatic stress syndrome as a result of the war, had to face entirely new realities as they entered this post-war world so suffused by nationalist fervor. Firstly, the Ottoman Empire was gone. Secondly, it was replaced by Britain and France. These two countries had in 1915 and 1916 secretly carried out a self-interested colonial partition of the region, the Sykes-Picot Accords, so-called, that was publicly revealed by the Bolsheviks in November 1917. Again, news of this trickled into Palestine very slowly. There were no newspapers, but people eventually found out. Against this could be set the possibilities of Arab independence and self-determination, which had been promised secretly by the British to Sharif Hussein of Mecca in 1916, and which was the subject of repeated public British pledges thereafter. They made pledges in Cairo, they made pledges in Baghdad, they made pledges to Sharif Hussein, which were then published. While these promises were at best partially and belatedly kept as regards other Arab peoples, they were never honored where the Arab population of Palestine was concerned, and I'll explain why that was. So as in the years after World War I, Turks, Iranians, Syrians, Egyptians, and Iraqis all achieved a certain measure of independence, albeit sometimes highly constrained and limited. No such option was on offer for the Palestinians. In Palestine, the British operated with a different set of rules than in other mandates and colonial possessions. This was a set of rules rigidly dictated by the terms of the Balfour Declaration and of the League of Nations mandate based on it. It was designed to foster a Jewish national home, the mandate. It was not designed to do anything for the Palestinians except protect their civil and religious rights. That's all they were entitled to under the mandate. In this respect, it contradicted the covenant of the League of Nations, Article 22, which proclaimed Palestine and other former Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire provisionally independent. The British ignored that. The declaration had been tailored to suit the desiderata of Zionism, this European colonizing movement, which had now acquired as its patron a formidable empire whose armies were in the process of conquering Palestine. British troops didn't leave Palestine for over 30 years, by which time the Zionist enterprise had become firmly entrenched, and the worst pre-war fears of those with ominous premonitions about Zionism were fully realized. Now, I've mentioned nationalism. The national idea began to take root in Palestine and other parts of the Middle East and some parts of Europe only in the latter part of the 19th century. Palestinian nationalism, Palestinian identity, is all too often seen to be no more than an expression of an unreasoning opposition to Jewish national self-determination. It's seen very one-dimensionally in that regard. In fact, Palestinian identity, like Zionism, emerged in response to many stimuli. Ironically, it did so at almost exactly the same time as political Zionism, all the claims of both very modern nationalism to ancient lineages notwithstanding. The encroachment of Zionism on Palestine was only one of these stimuli, just as anti-Semitism was only one of the stimuli for Zionism. Even before World War I, Palestinian identity, as it was developing, it was still not fully formed, included elements of local patriotism and love of country, a desire to improve society, Muslim and Christian religious attachment to Palestine as a holy land, and fear of European encroachment. Later, it drew strength from widespread frustration at the European colonial powers' blocking of Arab aspirations for freedom from foreign rule. All of these factors played a part in producing a sense of Palestinian identity. This identity is thus quite similar to the other Arab nation-state identities that emerged around the same time in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, within the frontiers for these new states that had been drawn by the European powers, largely on the basis of the Sykes-Picot Accords. Now, there's no question that Zionism was an important additional factor in the Palestinian case. But reducing Palestinian identity to mere opposition to Zionism betrays an appalling ignorance both of Palestinian identity and of the parallel histories of neighboring states, from which that of Palestine was in this respect little different. It reveals as well the obsessive tunnel vision, the tunnel vision obsession with Israel and Zionism of those who fall into the error of saying that were it not for Zionism, there would be no Palestinians. Such naysayers completely miss the fact that all the neighboring Arab peoples, the Lebanese, the Jordanians, the Syrians, and so forth, managed to develop 20th century national identities just like that of the Palestinians, without the dubious benefit of the emergence of Zionist colonialism in their midst. In fact, this attitude is of a piece with the views of Herzl and other Zionist leaders about the benefits of Zionism for the Palestinians. This is one of the oldest colonial tropes in the book. Without the white man, look where the benighted natives would be. They wouldn't even have an identity. I won't say any more about that. As soon as they were able to do so, in the wake of World War I, and in fact there are expressions of this sort in Weizmann's correspondence and in some of Herzl's writings. As soon as they were able to do so in the wake of World War I, the Palestinians began to oppose both the form of governance imposed by the British based on the Balfour Declaration and the introduction of the Zionist movement as a privileged interlocutor of the British. The mandate called for the establishment of a public body, a body established in public law, which would represent the issue of the Jewish community in Palestine, and which thereby came to have international status. So the Jewish agency was a quasi-state long before the State of Israel was established. It was able to go to the Permanent Mandates Commission in Geneva as a delegate. In other words, what the PLO achieved in the 70s, the Jewish agency had in 1922. It had a standing as an international public body. It was a quasi-state. And in this, it was recognized fully, not just by the British, but by the League of Nations. So the Palestinians both opposed the form of governance, the form of the mandate, and this privileged status of the Zionist movement. They did so initially in the shadow of a strict British military occupation regime that lasted until 1920, followed by rule by a series of British high commissioners. The first of them was Sir Herbert Samuel, later Lord Samuel, a committed Zionist, very intelligent man, a former cabinet minister who laid the governmental foundations for pretty much everything that followed in terms of the mandate. In understanding the efforts of the Palestinians to oppose this regime, two crucial factors are of paramount importance. The first is that unlike most other peoples who fell under the sway of colonial rule, the Palestinians had to contend not only with the colonial power in the metropole, with Britain, or with citizens of the metropole coming as settlers to the colony, as did South Africans, or as did Southern Rhodesians, or as did, in the case of France, Algerians. They also had to contend with the terms of the Balfour Declaration. Thus, they had to deal with a colonial settler movement which, while beholden to Britain, was independent of Britain and had an international base and international standing, most importantly, as it transpired, in the United States. When he was deported from Palestine, David Ben-Gurion I'm forgetting the name of his colleague, who later became the second president of Israel, came to New York and spent 2 years organizing here. So the foundations of the Zionist movement's ability to operate in the American political sphere were not laid with the Biltmore Declaration in 1942 or lobbying of Harry Truman in 1947. They were laid in 1917 and 1918. Yitzhak Ben-Zvi and Ben-Gurion are the two people I'm thinking of, by two of the most important leaders of the Zionist movement who spent 2 full years in New York, and they were not twiddling their thumbs. They were serious, hardworking people. They spoke a multiplicity of languages, and they were building what became, later on, obviously, the real base for the Zionist movement. So they were dealing with a settler movement, a colonial settler movement, which was beholden to Britain, but was independent of Britain and had an international base. That's the first issue that they had to contend with. The second issue they had to contend with is that Britain did not rule Palestine outright. It was not annexed. It was not a colony. It was not a crown possession like Aden or Egypt or other territories. Britain ruled Palestine as a mandatory power of the new League of Nations. In rejecting Palestinian protests about the Balfour Declaration, British officials just said, oh, no, don't look at us. They pointed to international legitimacy for the terms of the Balfour Declaration that were provided by the 1922 mandate for Palestine issued by the League of Nations. At the instigation of the British, the mandate incorporated verbatim the text of the Balfour Declaration and substantially amplified and expanded on its commitments. So the British could sort of hide behind the League of Nations whenever the Palestinians came at them and complained about the Balfour Declaration. The Palestinians were therefore in a triple bind, which may have been unique in the history of resistance of indigenous peoples to European colonial settler movements. They faced an international colonizing movement with a national mission and its own independent sources of finance and support besides those generously offered by Britain. Zev Sternhell, in a very, very good book, which nobody seems to pay attention to, The Founding Myths of Israel, has deduced that in the 1920s, the annual inflow of Jewish capital was on average 41.5% larger than the Jewish net domestic product. 1.5 times the domestic product of the Jewish economy was coming in annually in capital inflows. Think about that. That's like a river of money into any economy, and it was being invested and intelligently used for the entirety of the 20s. Its ratio to the national domestic product did not fall below 33% in any of the pre-World War II years and was kept at about 15% in all but 1 year since 1941. So you're talking about extraordinary international support independent of the military and diplomatic and other support that the British Empire was providing to Zionism, certainly until 1939, when things changed with the White Paper. We can talk about that if anybody has questions later. So the Palestinians faced the might of the British Empire in the era between the two world wars, when not one single colonial possession, with the partial exception of Ireland, succeeded in freeing itself from the clutches of the European imperial powers. They were facing this international colonizing movement, which had its own sources of finance and external support besides Britain, and they were facing an empire which gave up not one of its colonies, the partial exception of Ireland, in between the world wars. Finally, this is the triple part of the triple bind, they were confronted with the international legitimacy accorded to British rule by the League of Nations, which had in effect sanctified the Balfour Declaration and its colonial import for the Palestinians by endowing it with the legal sanction of the preeminent international body of the day. Now, the argument I'm going to make in the book is that this is the first of what amount to 3 international declarations of war on the Palestinians. The Balfour Declaration and the Mandate is a situation where it's not the Zionist movement that issues the declaration, it's the British and the League of Nations, in violation of the covenant of the League, let it be understood. And another similar case is the partition resolution. I won't talk about that today. And a third similar case is Resolution 242. In each of these cases, it's the international community that's taking a decision. It's not Israel or the Zionist movement. It's favorable in each case, the decision, to the Zionist movement or later on to the State of Israel. But these are international bodies that are taking these decisions. The Balfour Declaration, therefore, was no longer only a statement by the British cabinet. It was now an internationally sanctioned legal document. This is all important for understanding how the declaration and the terms of the mandate structured what thereafter happened. It is also important, alongside the shortcomings of Palestinian leaders, in explaining the failures of the Palestinians to overcome their difficult circumstances. I'm going to repeat that sentence. You might all do what I did before I started, which is turn off your phones. This is important as well alongside the shortcomings of Palestinian leaders in explaining the failures of the Palestinians to overcome their difficult circumstances and retain possession of their homes and control of their ancestral homeland. This is an argument I make in The Iron Cage, actually. Let me conclude. Before the issuance of the Balfour Declaration, the Zionist movement was a colonial enterprise without a fixed metropole, like an orphan searching for a foster parent. When it found a foster parent in Great Britain, as symbolized by the Balfour Declaration, the colonization and takeover of Palestine could begin in earnest. It was backed very soon afterwards by the international legitimacy provided by the League of Nations and by something else, by an indispensable, I'm now quoting, iron wall, unquote, of British bayonets, and the words I'm quoting are those of that most forthright of Zionist leaders, Zev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was the only, in my view, honest man in the Zionist leadership in the interwar period. He told it like it was. He talked about colonialism. He talked about indigenous peoples naturally resisting colonial takeovers. And he talked about the fact that there's no way that Zionism could do this without an iron wall, which had to be provided by an external power, which was impervious to the entreaties of the native population. He knew what he was talking about. He was no fool. And he cut through the fog, miasma of deception, self-deception, lies, and disingenuous comments by other Zionist leaders who said, oh, no, this will never harm the Palestinians will come around. Jabotinsky said, of course it's going to harm the Palestinians. Of course they won't come around. No people comes around to having their land taken over. And he was very forthright about that. Seen from the perspective of its victims, seen from the perspective of the Palestinians, rather than from the perspectives of Britain and the Zionists, the careful, calibrated prose of the Balfour Declaration amounted, as I've said, to a proclamation of war on the Palestinians. This war was waged in the interwar period and up to 1948 by the Zionist movement with money, legal means, propaganda, and guns and car bombs. Car bombs were a major feature of this war. It was waged as well by the British with multiple forms, including legal repression, exile, imprisonment, often without trial. Israeli detention without trial takes its founding text from 1945 British emergency regulations, which mandated detention without trial. The means also included warplanes, artillery, and summary executions. The issuance of the Balfour Declaration thus marked the beginning of what I would describe as a century-long colonial war in Palestine, supported by an array of outside powers, which continues to this day. Thank you very much. Feel free to fan yourselves.
Why don't you stay right there?
I will.
So I'd like to thank Rashid for his very lucid and wide-ranging and penetrating discussion of the implications of the Balfour Declaration for the Palestinians. I think my designation as discussant may prove maybe a misnomer. I don't have any significant exception to take with Rashid's analysis. I'll simply play the role of moderator and seize on that position to ask a first question, which actually will depart a little bit because it's an invitation to you to actually comment on another piece, right? That last phrase of the Balfour Declaration, right? About the political status, rights of Jews in other countries.
Yes.
And I raise this because here we are in 2017, a century after the issuance of the Balfour Declaration. And perhaps in some ways, we can see some of the implications of that piece of it playing out. So I'm thinking, for example, of the very friendly and close relationship between the Netanyahu government and the Trump administration, and the fact that not a few Israelis, not all by any means, but not a few Israelis welcomed the election of Donald Trump. And see him as an ally or a savior after the bad old days of the Obama administration, whatever basis in reality there is there. But more specifically, for example, the silence, even condoning by the Netanyahu government of, for example, the pretty openly anti-Semitic attacks of the Hungarian government, right against George Soros, clearly a populist right-wing anti-Semitism. And of course, the silence of the Netanyahu government and many people in Israel, right, many commentators, officials, politicians, about Charlottesville and what that implied about the status of American Jews. Are there ways in which we can see the complex relationship between Zionism, the state of Israel as it's played out over the century, and the status of Jews elsewhere being manifested in that language there, ways in which the first part of the project, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jews, a Jewish state, as it played out, contradicted that last part, right? The questioning, the undermining of the political status and rights of Jews in other countries. So maybe we could sort of talk a little bit about that relationship there.
Yeah, that's one of the least considered parts of the Balfour Declaration, and it's actually worth reflecting on why those words are in there. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or, and this is the phrase that you're referring to, the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The reason that this is in there is because the only Jewish cabinet minister, Samuel Montague, and other leading members of the British Jewish community, Lord Rothschild aside, were violently opposed to Zionism because they considered that it would harm their status and the status of the Jewish community in England, which had been had achieved hard-fought victories. I mean, they'd only achieved the vote a few decades earlier. Nonconformists, Catholics, Jews, non-Anglicans didn't have the vote in Britain until the middle of the 19th century. And Jews had been persecuted, had been expelled from England, had been expelled from France, had been expelled from many European countries. And so the status that Jews had achieved in England was a hard-won and as yet still precarious status. You had a Lord Rothschild and you had a Lord Montague and you had Jewish peers by this stage. But there was a profound fear, probably reflecting a very large proportion of the British Jewish community. Some people would argue perhaps a majority. Which was also reflected in the French Jewish community. The consistoire of French Jews came to the same conclusion, and they expressed their concerns about Zionism. Zionism was popular among certain segments of the Jewish community in Britain, especially recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, but the long-standing Jewish community was very, very afraid that it would affect their status and their rights, and would affect the way other Britons looked at them. If you have this national home there, that may be the place that you should go. So one of the ironies of the Balfour Declaration is it's issued by people, some of whom are Philo-Semites, for reasons having to do with their upbringing and their knowledge of the Bible, people like Lloyd George. And I think it's arguable that somebody like Balfour himself, who had, as Prime Minister, been responsible for the Aliens Act of 1904, which excluded Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe fleeing the pogroms, had another view in mind, which was, well, maybe they'll go elsewhere. And I think this was a concern in the minds of many leaders of the British Jewish community, and that's why that phrase is included there. Now, fast forwarding, we think of Zionism as representing all Jews. It didn't. In Britain, it didn't. Or he wouldn't have had the only Jewish cabinet member opposing it. It didn't in France at the time. It didn't in this country until the 1940s. Until the 1940s, the New York Times was not a Zionist paper. So, he said somebody mentioned the New York Times. Helga mentioned the New York Times. Well, the New York Times was not considered a friendly paper by the Zionist movement. And that's because it reflected a certain, I would argue, aristocratic German Jewish New York looking down their nose at the Zionists and at the people mainly from Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe who were the leaders of the Zionist movement. But it also represented exactly the same fears that are represented in this phrase, that Zionism might affect the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in the United States. Now, the United States was a country which we think of in 21st century terms. Well, everybody's equal in the United States. No, everybody wasn't equal in the United States in the 1940s or the 1930s or the 1920s. There were covenants that prevented people from leasing to Jews or Catholics or whoever they didn't like, mainly used against African Americans, but also used against Jews. All over Maryland, all over Washington, D.C., all over this state. It was outlawed in New York City, I think, under LaGuardia in the 1930s. But most of the country, there was rampant, rank anti-Semitism. And you had populist leaders in the 30s who did very well, basically spouting the kind of Jew hatred that you're hearing now and that you saw in Charlottesville. And in that environment, Zionism was a minority political trend. It was powerful. It had support. Ben-Gurion had done his work well. There were many, many committed, prominent American Zionists, Louis Brandeis, many others. But this was not a majority movement. And the people who opposed it, many of them had exactly the same views as the leaders of the British and the French Jewish communities in 1917 had. This will harm our status in our country, which we consider our own. That we have maybe a connection to Palestine, a connection to the Holy Land, a connection to the land of Israel, but that doesn't mean that that's our primary national loyalty or even a national loyalty at all. Zionism changes that. And it is now, it's become a completely different situation. The things that I'm saying to most kids in most Jewish day schools would seem incomprehensible because they're taught something completely different. It certainly would be incomprehensible to anybody who's come up through the Israeli school system. Incomprehensible. Or anybody who was, educated even in the 30s and the 40s. The Zionist movement took over the schools, controlled them, and it used them for indoctrination from way back. That's one of the things that the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate do. So people have been taught a very different view of history and a very different understanding of all of these things. But at the time, in 1917, in the case of the British Jewish community, and much later in the case of the American Jewish community, these were open questions. I don't know if they're going to become open questions again. I mean, it'll depend on a younger generation of people in the Jewish community and how anti-Semitism in this country, how it rears its ugly head. The irony, of course, is that when there is actual formal Jew hatred, something where Jews are targeted as Jews will not replace us, chanted, publicly by marching militants with torches, for God's sakes, it's argued that people who support Palestinian rights are the real anti-Semites who have to be combated. And here's a perfect example of what is Zionism doing here. It's using anti-Semitism as a shield to defend itself in issues that are purely Palestinian-Israeli. They have nothing to do with the community here, where the community here is actually facing torchlight marches by Nazis. I mean, I don't think that these Nazis represent a direct threat to most people, but they are overt anti-Semites, Jew haters. And that's not the problem. No, it's BDS or whatever, Palestinian activism, that's the problem. Here's a case where it can be argued, the case that's made for Zionism, that it's the only possible protection for Jews, and it's the solution to the Jewish problem, comes under at least should come under grave questioning. I mean, to what extent does an Israeli prime minister who kiss with a fanatic anti-Semite in a country like Hungary, what does he do for the Jewish community of Hungary? Well, he's harming it. Now, is that good for the Jews? Is that good for the Jews of Hungary? Is that good for Israel is another question. But you could say the same thing about Netanyahu. You could say the same thing about Netanyahu and Trump. I don't think it's reached the point of Orban and Hungary, where you actually had a fascist regime in World War II. I mean, a fascist government under Admiral Horthy, which sent troops to fight with the Nazis on the Eastern Front. We never had that in this country. Lindenberg didn't become president, so we were lucky. Thank you all very much.